Time for a weekly best decks roundup for Marvel Snap. In the wake of the Galactus buff, let's break down what are the most popular decks on Untap, what has the best performing metrics, and new diamonds in the rough that might be the next big thing. Let's dive into it. We kick off my Jeff's picks this week with an incredibly disruptive deck leveraging some off-meta stat sticks that was born out of a very meme idea. The thing that was suggested to me by my chat was that if we Vipered a Hellcow path, and then activated the Hellcow that turn as well, we could donate it to our opponent, making them discard the 2 cards from their hand on turn 5. While this deck is definitely capable of doing exactly that, and a lot of matchups such as Hela, for example, that's just genuinely not good, but the rest of what this deck had going on felt really powerful in the games that I was playing. Specifically, this deck list has disruptive elements in attacking their hand with Moon Knight and Spider-Ham. It has things that play to the board nicely like US Agent and Killmonger, and then Hellcow in tandem with Dakin, Strong Guy, and Proxima Midnight really let us put a surprising amount of stats into play on the last turn of the game in a way that our opponents often weren't expecting. Because this deck list is also leveraging Viper, not only to do a meme thing with Hellcow, but also in tandem with Hood, it also gives you a little bit of extra counterplay into things like Galactus without having us lean into being a fully dedicated Clog deck. As far as higher series cards in this deck list go, Proxima Midnight and Spider-Ham are the 2 must-haves in my opinion. Proxima gets us a lot of extra stats, and Spider-Ham in tandem with Moon Knight helps us be disruptive enough to beat Hela consistently. Dakin as well as US Agent are primarily here for stats, so you can play other 3 and 2 energy cards to just put numbers into play. And Nico Minoru has good utility, but she could definitely substitute for something like Iceman for additional disruption. We kick off our high potential category with a Ronin Darkhawk brew this week. For people who are new to my roundup, these high potential decks are ones that have smaller sample sizes on Untap so far, but they have really promising performance stats in those smaller samples. They could easily be the next big thing if their sample size grows and their performance stays the same. I'm not super surprised to see a deck like this show some promise. I think the Darkhawk package of breaking up your opponent's draws with Korg and Rockslide are quite good into decks like Hela and other combo decks trying to go over the top of Hela, and Master Mold serves kind of a similar purpose. A lot of these decks like Hela are often skipping the first turn or 2 of the game, which means when you Master Mold them on turn 2, putting 2 Sentinels into their hand, you're not only having a chance to disrupt something like a Blade or a Colleen Wing, but you're also often cutting them off of a draw, which can grow not only Ronin, but also Darkhawk down the line that you're slamming into play as well. I also think Cosmo is phenomenally positioned in this current metagame. In addition to being able to play a shell game on the last turn into Hela, it's also phenomenal into people trying to do Galactus or Symbiote Spider-Man or Wong things, going massive in this format. Mystique serves kind of a dual role here, being not only able to duplicate Darkhawk or Ronin on the last turn, but also making it so you could Cosmo 2 paths to insulate protection for your big threats or disruption against what your opponent's bringing to the board. As far as higher series cards go in this deck list, Darkhawk is obviously non-negotiable, and I would go so far as to say Iron Lad's probably pretty important as well, giving you redundancy as not only an additional stat stick, but also potentially doubling up your disruptive cards as well. Cassandra Nova and Silver Sable are probably fairly replaceable with other cheap 3 energy stat sticks or 1 energy card such as Spider-Ham or others that fill your curve out nicely. Our second high potential deck list this week is a Werewolf by Night, a Nihilist deck that I think is an awesome mashup that's well positioned in our current metagame. The Clog aspect of this deck is obviously good into things like Hela, and I think being the bigger Clog deck in Clog mirror matches, i.e. playing a Nihilist, gives you a strong edge, being able to send whatever they're putting over to your side of the board. I also love the inclusion of Circe here as an additional way to clear Sentry's Void or upgrade rocks or hoods that your opponent donates over to you. Unfortunately, this deck is the furthest thing from a budget deck possible, being a majority Series 5 cards. I honestly think if you're picking apart too much of it, you're probably going to lose a lot of power level, unfortunately. We kick off our top performers this week with a Legion Lockout mashup featuring a movement package at the bottom end of its curve that seems quite slick. These top performers are decks that have solid sample sizes on Untapped and have generally been putting up metrics for a number of weeks. While there are a variety of Legion lockout shells looking to storm on 3 or 4, and then Legion that flooded on the 5th turn to effectively end the game a turn early, I really like the angle that this one is taking and is finding a lot of success, being the top performing deck in the group. Specifically, while War Machine directly lets you play additional cards out on turn 6, Madam Web gives you an additional way to manipulate the board on that final turn when your opponent likely can't interact. By leaving something like a dagger or a vulture in her lane, you can slide that card to a lane that'll give you a deterministic victory while your opponent is stuck looking at a board that they can't play anything out to. Most of the higher series cards here are unfortunately pretty unique in function, with even going so far as to say Nebula is probably the only one that's remotely replaceable, likely with another good 1 energy card such as Iceman. Our next top performer this week is the Oddhawk deck, which card for card has been a part of my weekly best decks roundups, I think almost every week since Moon Knight was reworked. This deck list absolutely picks apart combo decks like Hela, both disrupting their draw proactively with the rock disruptors and attacking their hand proactively again with things like Spider Ham and Moon Knight. If you're someone that likes having a chance at every single game of Marvel Snap that you play, this is definitely the deck list for you and has a proven history of being a top performer now. Our next top performer this week is Bounce, with this Werewolf by Night variation putting up the best metrics so far this patch on Untapped. It is worth noting that my preferred Wiccan Bounce builds that aren't playing tech cards also have some solid numbers up there as well, but they're slightly below what this newer version featuring Activate Black Swan is currently doing. Fortunately, similar to a lot of the other deck lists that we've looked at today, this one has a lot of Series 4 and 5 cards in it that are pretty mechanically unique and don't really have clean substitutions. Silver Sable and Sage are probably the most replaceable in this deck list for other 1 and 3 energy cards that have on reveals to jump your wolf around the board. Our next top performer also blends our way into the most popular category, with Hela now seeing single-digit play rate percentages for most data slices on Untapped, but still putting up some of the strongest performances on the site. It's noteworthy that while she now gives -3 to the things she reanimates, if you have Luke Cage out, her change in this last OTA actually just ends up being a buff, since she's now up to 7 points of power. As far as higher series cards go, Blink is pretty important for adding consistency in this deck to help you dig to Hela more frequently, but Red Hulk is definitely super replaceable with other 6 energy bombs such as Giganto. Our last top performer this week that also falls into the most popular category is Erishim. This deck list is kind of just card for card what this deck had settled on before they nerfed Loki and made Erishim start adding 27 cards to the deck. It's still just kind of quietly putting up really strong numbers, while also being one of the more popular decks on the Untapped tracker for most data slices. Unsurprisingly, after his buff, Galactus is the most popular archetype on Untapped as people try to explore and figure out if this big bad is now competitive. Being paired with Symbiote Spider-Man and often Hobgoblin in most of his shells, it's worth noting that while this particular Wiccan build that I have up on your screen does have pretty solid stats on Untapped, by and large, the Galactus decks are coming up incredibly short, having pretty poor metrics overall. If this keeps up, I wouldn't be surprised to see this card fade back off into obscurity in the coming weeks. Galactus' poor performance is likely related to the fact that Clog is the second or first most popular deck on Untapped right now, depending on where you slice the data. Interestingly enough, though, despite this archetype generally speaking being good against Hela and obviously Galactus, it's actually struggling overall in the archetype category. This particular build that I have up on your screen is the best performing individual 12 cards for this deck, and I think it's especially noteworthy that it's choosing to play Red Guardian, likely as a way to help you tag Luke Cage's in that Hela matchup to push it even more into your favor. Our last deck in the popular category this week is the Movement deck, with this Living Tribunal variation being one of the better performers. It is worth noting overall that the Move decks have absolutely terrible metrics for most slices on Untapped right now, even worse than they had in previous weeks. I think this is likely very related to the fact that Galactus is an atrocious matchup for this deck, traditionally speaking, and that deck is super popular right now. Finally, we're bringing back the best in class category this week to showcase the least embarrassing Scarlet Spider deck by the numbers on Untapped. He is quite novel when you pair him with Nomura, letting you double up Nomura's bonus across the board, but it is worth noting that the metrics on our latest card release overall are quite bad, and if Hulkling hadn't released last month, I would go as far to say it's the worst card Snap has released in a while. It feels especially clunky with Activate and often gets stranded in your hand, being unable to work into your curve in a lot of decks that you're trying to play him in my experience. While this deck seems very serviceable because Nomura Wong stuff is good, honestly, you should probably just sub Scarlet Spider into Erishim if you're trying to get your weekend missions done in the most efficient way possible. Personally, I've been kind of struggling to brew inside of this format. A lot of the typical ways I would try and color outside the lines don't feel very effective into either Hela or Galactus or some mix of the other bigger linear decks that are attacking them. I will say that Wiccan Bounce has still been able to be my happy place, adding another infinite border to my collection inside of Conquest this week, and generally sparking joy for me as I pick my cards back up and play them out again over turns 4, 5, and 6. As always, if you enjoyed my decks roundup this week, be sure to snap that like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any other game news updates and tidbits about Marvel Snap here every single week.